Welcome. We're so excited for our guest today, Jeff Myers, who's a parent advocate at Save Oregon Schools based in Beaverton, Oregon. He's also been on the front lines fighting indoctrination in the classroom. Jeff, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, Scarlen, thank you so much. It is an honor to be here, be talking with you, be on this platform. I so appreciate it.
All right, Jeff. So again, thanks for joining us. So before we dive in, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, well, thanks. So I guess this is not my day job, fighting with schools and fighting for children. I do have a day job. I'm a data geek. I work in operations, working with data, and that's probably what really drew me into digging into schools. I think it was about 18 months ago where I heard the CRT thing that was going on, and it was in the news, and thought, all right, let me go grab a book and see if I can learn about what it's about. Read Cynical Theories, then I read How to Be an Anti-Racist, and then I was just in and started meeting in school boards, meeting other parents, and 18 months later, here we are.
Right? Once you know, you can't just leave it alone. You have to act. Right? So, Jeff, let's dive in. You've done some extensive research on restorative justice, and you have lived through it in practice in your local schools, which we'll get to hear later. But explain to people, in your experience, what is restorative justice?
You know, that's a good underlying question because we hear it in the news, like we have progressive district attorneys and what's happening there, soft on crime approach, but then to think of it, well, what would that look like in schools? And I think of it a lot like how you parent children. Like if you have 2 or more kids, the concept's pretty straightforward, right? That people need to connect with one another, those in a family or those in school, that we are humans and we are not individuals. We're part of a group and we need to learn, and we get things from working with others. So restorative practices or restorative justice is, builds on that to say, well, we need to be able to connect with one another. And to be able to do that, we need to learn empathy. We need to be able to put ourselves in other people's shoes and understand their perspective. And it's more of a part of social emotional learning, but they're tied together. But where restorative justice, restorative practices come in is when there's been harm, right? There's been some hit to the relationship where we now need to restore it, right? That's the simple concept. So, one kid hits another kid. Well, what was the fight about? Why were you upset? What maybe was misunderstood? How can we bring you back together so that you both can continue on? Because if this happened early in life, you're going to be with the same kid in school for the next 10, 12 years. So we need to rebuild that relationship. So again, surface level, it's an obvious thing that we should be doing.
Right. It sounds so great in practice. So thank you so much for illustrating what restorative justice is. So now tell us all about restorative justice in Beaverton.
Yeah, so I guess this is where I put on my data geek hat, right? And this is my comfort zone of digging in, right? Because the outcome, or at least what drew me to this and looking into it, was that we have classrooms in chaos, right? I have this horrible video that I will not share. I don't want to share, but I got a video of just 2 girls fighting, one dragging the other out of a bathroom by her hair and just beating her about the head. And the worst, I mean, it still gets to me. The worst part about it was going frame by frame, and you can see the other kids' reactions in the hallway, and there were kids just walking by and other kids smiling, a couple other kids filming it. This is it's been normalized. I mean, that's what I took away. Like, wow, these kids are normalized to violence. And that was last year. And I just thought, okay, I got to get to the root of this. I got to understand what was the root cause, where did this go? That's kind of where this tale of Beaverton has unfolded, where what I learned is that, and I'll try to there's a lot of details. I'll be as high level as I can. We'll dig in if we need to, but the Beaverton School District, where I am, it's now the 2nd largest school district in Oregon, and they were part of what they called an Oregon Leadership Network. So the OLN was something where some districts got together as this partnership that was led by an outside company called Education Northwest, and it was a way to share ideas, to learn together, to grow together, to experiment, try new things. And several of the school districts, including ours, went in 2013-14 school year to implement restorative justice as a way to reduce the disparities in disciplinary rates. Right? So that was very targeted to, and based on their data, Black kids were getting suspended at 2.5x the rate of white kids. And then they had all the other rates for different races, and you actually saw like Asian children who were getting suspended less often than white children, but all the other racial groups are, had the male-female split, things like that, showed there are these disparities. So restorative justice was implemented as a way to fix that. And so they kicked off this research study in 2013-14 for all middle schools, and then it was extended to all grades soon after. And I wish I knew the date, but there is no one who has the date as to when that occurred. But this program was meant to run for 4 years. So they were using our school district and others, so easily 120, 150,000 kids were part of a research experiment that maybe they didn't know. And this experiment was to try to get rid of the disparities through this new restorative justice approach. Through the course of those 4 years, you saw a drop in disciplinary rates where there were just fewer suspensions and expulsions. Like I've seen the data, I did public records requests and got the actual disciplinary data, and you see that they were able to reduce overall suspensions and expulsions. However, the disparities didn't go away. And what I found, and this is anecdotal because the data is not tracked and it was hard to get anyone to admit it, but that they were artificially limiting the suspensions. This is where you might hear this, and other parents, this may resonate with you, where you hear there's been a desire to keep kids in the classroom. Right? We need to prioritize classroom time because a kid's not learning if they're not in the classroom. And it's like, okay, that makes sense. So there was a real push to keep them in the classroom. The training, and we'll probably dig into that later, but the training was pretty light in how to teach teachers to be mediators, to deliver this process. The staffing was not there to give them the support so they could practice and try this and get support as they're running through the first few scenarios. But and this is the part that really got me, is at near the end of the 4th year, there was a declaration of victory where the outside vendor, Education Northwest, and both the district released statements saying this worked. Restorative justice worked to reduce overall exclusionary discipline. It reduced by 40%. You say, that's great. Like, who wouldn't want fewer kids suspended if you're able to still learn and keep schools safe? But the problem was that was after the 3rd year. They didn't wait until the final end of the 4th year to use that data, which they would have seen disciplinary rates starting to shoot back up. And that's where the story takes the turn, where, and I'll quickly go through the rest, but you see the rates start going back up and then up and up and up for the next few years, even up until the pandemic. There were, classrooms were getting chaotic. There were classroom clears, which weren't being tracked, but new things, new problems were starting to occur while they were still implementing restorative justice. And
so, yeah. Jeff, just one quick second here. I just want to go back to something that you had said so we can highlight it for our parents. Mm-hmm. You're saying that they brought down suspensions not because there was less violence in schools, but they just didn't discipline as much?
Yeah, and this is the tricky part, where there was a pressure and no one really wants to talk about it because it never works out for the whistleblower. I'm sorry, it doesn't. So people are very scared to talk, but that there definitely was a pressure on administrators, and then the teachers felt it to not suspend children. And that's where they put the language of keeping kids in the classroom, right? That was what they would say, is it sounds nicer to say, we're going to keep kids in the classroom and that's where they're going to learn. But the problem is then you had one kid who's dysregulated, having a hard day, they can't leave the classroom to get support. They're put right back in the classroom. And then if they're not able to be, supported, then they might blow up and go bigger. And then they're throwing pencils or chucking chairs across the room. And then that's when classroom clears started to become a thing. So now you have one kid who you can't touch, can't restrain them. You need to just leave the rooms. All the kids leave the room. You have to call in principal to come down. And now no one's learning. So that's the funny part. It's not really funny, but the sad part of how it worked out, where now you don't just have one kid struggling, you have all, and not learning, you have all 30 not learning, and the one kid still struggling in the classroom alone.
So from what you found that they did stop the suspensions, and there wasn't much discipline for the years that they were tracking all of this stuff, but then it had started going back up anyway.
Yeah, because they were, artificially limiting the suspensions, but then it's kind of funny. It's like, what happens when you parent your children and you just take away the consequences? Does that go well? Maybe for some kids they respond to that, or maybe not. But the problem you have when you got 25, 30 kids in a classroom and some kid acts out and there is no consequence, you start getting copycats. Like, talk to any teacher. Like, my wife's a teacher. I know other teachers, and they say, yeah, oh, yeah, that's what's happening. One kid's jumping around on chairs. We can't get him out of the room. The other kids think, that looks fun. And they start jumping around on chairs. So then you got the not so naughty kids now being naughty because they see that we're not able to do anything about the one who really needs the help. And that's why I think in 2018 it was that local news station KGW did a whole series on classrooms in crisis because of this. So that's why I say the study didn't work. It didn't remove the disparities, yet the district went all in on it still, even though it didn't work. And then the data just shows you suspensions kept marching back up because they couldn't just not suspend. There were kids doing violent things, so they were pressured to have to suspend still, while still implementing restorative justice, but it led to crazy classrooms. Then the pandemic hit, and coming out of it now, I mean, just ask the union, 52% of teachers want to leave the profession. That was their survey from last year that the union shared. And a lot of it's because of the classrooms, the mismanagement, the just out of control classrooms. And the district created this themselves.
Right, they created this, and then when teachers ask for support, there really isn't any support to be found. Is that right?
Yeah, it's starting to change, and I will acknowledge that, I've spent some time meeting with, we have a new superintendent this year, a new deputy superintendent of teaching and learning. There's new principals that have come into schools, and I'm willing to acknowledge when I see change, and I have seen change, right? They're starting to bring back consequences and those kind of clear boundaries of what is and is not allowed. It's not that they've kicked restorative justice out the door, but now they see it as, well, it's a tool in the tool bag. It's not the end all be all. It's not meant to replace. It is meant to be a way to restore a relationship, but it's not for every situation. And even I read a book about this too, and I've researched this. No one rolls out this program as a complete replacement for exclusionary discipline. It's a tool in the process. You might still have to suspend somebody and give a consequence, but maybe it's not as big of a consequence because you're going to come back and try to repair things so that this doesn't happen again. But Beaverton, for whatever reason, they went in they didn't went in a direction that no evidence or even training program would tell them to do it. It was more extreme. And we're now dealing with the consequences after 9 years.
Yeah, right. So when you had collected all of this data, did you bring it to the school board's attention, to the superintendents? And if you did, what did they tell you?
So I did last year, and I'd say the previous superintendent, I'd say I'm not his biggest fan, and I'm sure the feeling's mutual. They didn't listen, right? Their view of parents was, if you don't agree, then I don't want to hear from you. And that's kind of how we felt. And that's why we had to get loud and start getting public and release records and try to get a news story, get coverage for this, because they're not willing to talk. And they just wouldn't engage in this conversation. So I wish we had that chance. I'd say now with the new administration, they are listening. It's not like they can pivot on this in a second. And it's less, I've talked to a couple board members, just things may be different in different states, but I'm still learning too, but for school boards, right, they'll set the policies. They give the high level, they'll stamp on, the strategic plan if there is one, and their strategy, they're just like the board of directors at a company. They don't get into the day-to-day implementation of things. So the board in Beaverton is kind of one step removed, where there's nothing in the policy necessarily they need to change, but they recognize that, hey, things are out of control, and this is an area where they would like to see some input or some planning from the superintendent. The superintendent and his staff, though, are definitely willing to meet. I mean, I've had meetings just in the start of the school year with, like I said, superintendent, deputy superintendent we've met with twice. I've had coffee with another one. They are willing to talk. There was a fundamental change in their approach this year in engaging with parents, and I love it. I'm cautiously optimistic, but we still have a lot of work to do, but I'm hoping we can now partner with them on it versus feel like it's an adversarial relationship.
Well, that's refreshing to hear because, in different districts, different school districts across the country, not every superintendent is willing to listen to parents. So I'm glad that, they're now listening to you. So with that being said, where does everything stand today? Are restorative practices still being utilized in Beaverton as discipline?
Yeah, so they do use it, and this is a bit of the funny part. They're I'm trying to think even how best to word this, where they have the support to continue doing it, right? And some of the board policies the school, that define what the school district can or cannot do call out, have language that says that they need to be doing things that restorative justice should do. I'd say that they're in this transition phase, if I call it that, where they're willing to bring back traditional discipline. They're not ready to get rid of restorative justice, but I've heard a couple of people within the school say what I think are the right things, that restorative justice is a tool and that we'd want to repair relationships, right? That's what it was meant to do at its core. It wasn't meant to replace suspensions. It was meant to once I've suspended a kid and brought them back, if they deserved a suspension, how do I then make things right? Putting them right back in the classroom, it probably didn't do anything, especially if they just went home and were on an iPad all day, right? So what could they do as school staff to help rebuild things? Now, I say it's a bit funny because I would say they've never implemented restorative justice as it should be implemented. And this is me coming as somebody who, hey, I read a couple of books and spent some time researching it, but I've talked with a lot of folks too, and where to do it properly, you need time. You have to learn how to be a mediator. That's part of it. If you learn, there's organizations, IIRP, forget what it stands for, but they're one that push and offer training in restorative practices. It is a conversation, it's a process, it's a mediation that you need to do. And some of the examples they'll give is, hey, after class, pull a child, pull the other children who were involved, have a restorative circle. And it could be a fairly quick, process, but you work through the process. And I'm thinking, how would that be done when our middle schools have 4-minute passing periods? There's no way. And it also involved, they mentioned, bring in an outside party, somebody in another school staff member who can come in and help with the mediation as well. And no, they didn't have the staff there. But what's changing now is they are staffing up, and they do have social workers and others who can fulfill these roles. I do wonder if they've been trained to do this mediation work, because what the teachers got was very light and more, hey, teach a couple people at each school, train the trainer, they'll roll it out to the rest of the staff, and we're done. That doesn't work. Sorry. I mean, especially when you're talking about major skills like learn how to be a mediator, and how do you do it when Oregon has some of the highest class sizes in the country, and we have some of the lowest instructional hours, which just means we're cramming as much as we can in every day. Where are they going to fit this in? They get new curriculum coming, new standards coming. Now I sound like I'm in the teachers union. I'm like, but I'm an advocate for the teachers too. They're struggling, and this is just one more thing that was dumped on them to learn how to be mediators and get in the middle of this amongst everything else they're asked to do. This was never going to work. So it stands that they're still trying it. Again, cautiously optimistic that they'll learn to to put it in the right place and train the right people and use it where it makes sense, but not just to horseshoe it in and hope that it works. And follow the data.
Right. Yeah, I agree, because, the more that I read about restorative justice, and I read, the books by these advocates that want restorative justice or restorative practice in schools, there's an entire process that you have to follow. And if, like you were saying, a child in middle school or high school, their class time is anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour. Where are they going to find the time? Where are they going to find the time to put all of these kids in a circle, talk about how everyone's feeling, and then move into classroom material? And then sometimes there's a few surveys involved as well. So where are they going to find the time? And a lot of the times too, like you were saying, no one really gets trained. Here in my school district, it was just a two-day training. That was a train the trainer, and then everyone went on their way. So no one was fully trained to be an actual mediator. But like I said, it as I've been reading the books, it sounds good on paper and like it could work. So then my question to you is, are there times when restorative justice can work, and are there times when it's completely inappropriate?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's appropriate. I made the comment earlier about being a parent of two kids, right? If my two kids are fighting, and they do, they know they do, that they're going to be around each other for a long time. And I've said this, since maybe it's a sad way to put it, but that they'll be there, you know, hopefully, God willing, they will be there together for the rest of their lives beyond when I'm around. So they need to learn how to work together and be good siblings. And so I want them to have a good relationship. So when they're fighting, again, I'm not always a perfect parent doing the right thing in the right moment every time, but I need to work on building that relationship back. And it might be, hey, you did something to your brother. What would be meaningful to him to make up for this? Not just like always write him a letter or write him a note or give him a hug. He doesn't like hugs. So it's finding how do we know him, or teaching my daughter how to know my brother or her brother, or vice versa, so that they can do something to repair the relationship. So, you know, parents are trying to do this, I'm sure, and this is just doing it in school. And yeah, we're putting this fancy name on it, restorative practices, but I think this is just at its core empathy and making things right. It's just been, and maybe it's just the name that's the problem, that it's now been linked to too many things, or it's been implemented so poorly. But just going back to your question, sorry, I went off on a tangent. I think it can work in school, and I'll use this example. I stole it from somebody else, but it's a simple one. If you've got, you know, Johnny and Janie out in the playground, they're fighting over a ball or a swing, and they, you know, have a tussle, or they're just yelling at each other. That's a perfect opportunity to pull back and find out, okay, what was the problem? Oh, John had promised to give Janie the turn after 3 minutes, but then he kept playing on it. Well, then why would he do that? Maybe it's because the other kid before him went longer, but help them understand why the wrong happened, and then make a plan to make it right, and do it in the moment if it's appropriate. And then that's great. But if you got another kid who's just throwing chairs because they've had a really tough day, or maybe, you know, their dad's in the hospital and that just happened this morning, and they're just not able to process it, and so they're just dumping chairs in the middle of the room. I don't know what the restorative justice or restorative conference would look like. I think we need to get that kid help, and it's probably not sticking them in the classroom. We need to get them with somebody who can help them work through their feelings, and it's not in the middle of the class with all the kids staring at them. Sorry. And even if they come back later, it may not be appropriate to have that restorative conversation. It may be too private, you know, so it's not a one size fits all, but I'd say there are situations where absolutely it makes sense. It was just our school district tried to shove it into everything. And this is not the first time they've done that. I'd say this is a trend, and I hope other schools are not doing the same thing.
Right. You know, it can potentially work if there's a minor disagreement within the classroom. But what about, you know, a kid that knocks the teacher out? That's an incident that happened here in one of my local schools. You know, how do we restorative justice our way out of that one when you're physically assaulting a teacher?
Yeah.
So what are some signs that parents can look for to see if their child's school is implementing restorative justice?
Yeah. Actually, if you don't mind, I want to make one quick comment about something you just said, because I think it's an important takeaway for anyone. This is what I've been learning too. Of a kid hits a teacher, or hits another kid, or that story mentioned of those kids fighting, right? In the heat of the moment, when emotions are hot and the fighting just happened, you don't do it then. You don't have let's sit down and get in chairs and have a restorative conference and circle. Nope. No one's like, emotions are hot. It likely is, if a kid punches a teacher, suspended, you're out. Like, you need to have boundaries. And I think that's what's happening and changing in Beaverton. They're bringing back some of those boundaries, which is good. But when the student comes back, that's where you could do that, to say, look, and maybe it's in the morning before school starts. The student comes in with their parents, and then the teacher, and then with the, maybe assistant principal, so that everybody feels supported, and then we can talk it through when no one's hot. That could be a good use of it as well, right? So I just want to make sure to touch on that, because again, it can be in those tough situations, but it isn't the only thing, and it isn't something you do in the moment. You have to really know. That's why it's hard. A teacher getting half-day training than training others amongst everything else. You think they're ready to implement this? 9 years later, Beaverton still can't do it. I've been asking, and they're not able to do it because they haven't practiced it and implemented it fully. Now I sound like I'm beating on the district. It is what it is. But to your questions, all right, the signs they can see where it's been implemented. Yeah, so obviously a lot of the signs are things that we've talked about, right? Where sometimes they'll just call it restorative justice, restorative discipline. They may just call it what it is, that we're prioritizing this, or you'll hear them talk about the disciplinary rates. How do we bring that down? They'll reference the school to prison pipeline. I know that is a often used study that I don't think carries much weight because it's just a poorly researched, poorly done study that, again, as a data person, it's flawed. The whole research premise is flawed. But the other signs would be, reducing the disparities in disciplinary rates, or just disparities in general. They'll often tied to, well, maybe there's disparities in student achievement due to exclusionary discipline, or kids not being in classrooms or not being treated fairly. So a lot of these things are interconnected. And then trying to think what else you might, yeah, I guess the big warning sign for me is if you see it as a replacement for exclusionary discipline, right? If you, that's probably the biggest red flag to me as a parent. You might hear that it's happening, or they're doing social emotional learning and talking about empathy, which is a part of restorative practices too. So if they're doing social emotional learning, or they're having restorative circles in the morning, like circle time, they're already talking about this. But the red flag would be if they are looking at this as a way to reduce exclusionary discipline, period, or to reduce the disciplinary rates. Because again, my school district was one of others, and it proved it does not work. Again, as a data person, I'd say, wait a minute, you did a study, you did for 4 years, it didn't work. And it's funny, the district staff I've talked to recently acknowledged it did not work. They agree. But the person involved in the study was not involved in the decision for them to implement it, which I think is, it's just insane. But that's what we've been dealing with.
Yeah, that's interesting. And one of the red flags to me that has also come up when I'm researching different school districts, and I just saw it from a parent in a parent group in Poway, California. The Poway Unified School District has a tiered school school code of conduct, and I've found that in different districts that have restorative justice as well. But I wanted to go back to a word that we've been highlighting often, the word disparities. So what do you mean by disparities? Disparities between who?
Yeah, so it's they'll say disparities in student groups, right? So we'll hear between different racial groups. So we want to see the discipline, and this is part of what came out of the study, was this company, Education Northwest, worked with them on how to collect data. But it was, all they did is help them create the difference in rate. So we could say, because there's a different number of Black kids and white kids and Hispanic children, and right, so they're different numbers, but if we come down to the rate of out of 100, maybe how many of them are getting suspended in a given year? And so if they were using white as the baseline, and then they looked at the differences around for the other racial groups. And I think Black was, it was 2.5x at the time they started the study. And like Hispanic was 1 point something X, and like Asian, I think was 0.3x. But then they also split by, male, female, or may have also done it by sexual preference or something. They had some other different categories in the way they slice and dice the data. But that's what it comes down to, is they just kind of slice and dice the students by different groupings, some overlapping, and look for differences. And the scary part is that I'll say this is one sorry to cut you off there. It's just one odd thing that I heard, and this is where parents need to be careful too, is when there was a board member talking about the work isn't done until we get to no disparities. There's another board member who wants to get to no exclusionary discipline, that's a problem. But even getting to zero differences, the way I think of it as a teacher, and I did the math for Oregon, it'll be different in different states, but in Oregon, a teacher has about a fifth of a student's awake hours in a year. So they're sleeping for maybe 9 hours a day. For the time that they're awake, the teacher's with them about a fifth the time in a year. So there's 4/5 of the time that they're not around them. How can you guarantee outcomes when you're only around the kid 20% of the time that they're awake? You can't affect, like, we don't know what happens when they go home, or do they walk home? Do they, what's their family life like? Do they have one parent, two parents living with a grandparent? Is there, was there a death in the family? Who knows? You can't control that. So the only way you're ever going to get to zero differences in disparities is by gaming the system. Right? Like, this is coming from somebody who does data work, and has been doing it for decades. Like, there is no other way, unless you take over the parenting. And I think that's where some people are concerned that's happening.
Yeah, well, thank you for clarifying that. And that reminds me of a story in the state of Washington. I think it was in the Ferndale school district. There was two students that started fighting, and I don't know how it got to this, but they started throwing poop at each other. And and they didn't get disciplined because the boys happened to be Native American. And if the teacher who happened to be white were to discipline these boys, then she would be considered a racist. So thanks for clarifying that and reminding me of that weird story.
Oh, wonderful story. Thank you, Scarlen, for sharing that.
So what can parents do to bring back traditional discipline in their child's school?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. And I say that partly because I wouldn't say that we've won that battle yet. I mentioned earlier being cautiously optimistic. Part of it could be just how bad are the behaviors in your school and how effective restorative justice has been at addressing them, right? I think because each school is going to be different. I found out anything, it's each classroom in each school, in each district is different. So I think you need to start by finding out, well, what is happening in your classroom? So what is your teacher's approach to discipline? What is that school's principal's approach to discipline? And what is the district's approach? Because, like, what's being taught in classrooms, how discipline is handled, I can guarantee you, even if a district had a very, very progressive, soft on crime, restorative justice like ours did, there were still kids getting suspended. There were still kids getting disciplined appropriately, and then, if they could, restore. So how to bring it back, I guess part of it is finding out, is it really gone, and at what level? And you could take the approach I did, which is, right, let's get the data. Go get the data. They have it. Do a public records request and say, I want to see your schools and your district's disciplinary history. Find out when they implemented restorative justice. Look for, have things changed? Remind them of why they implemented it and did it work. And I hate to have to go public with things, but I'm willing to do that. And sometimes it's hard to get a reporter, somebody to cover. I know, I get that. But using board meetings, using opportunities to speak, that's probably going to make the most difference. And I would hope that you could get to, give school administrators the shot first before going other ways or declaring war. But sometimes you kind of have to get out there and make it tough to get their ear and get their attention. I guess the last part I'd say too is finding out what other outside influences are in there that could be holding them hostage to implementing it. And that may involve asking them the questions like, hey, are you doing this because of your state has handed down a rule? So they're just stuck. So then that might tell you, okay, now go talk to your state, legislature and find out if there's a law that demands they do this, get that changed, get in front of them. Is there an outside consultant that got hired? So part of it's just do the digging. Don't just assume that they're really bad people trying to hurt your children. They're not. I think some may be lost. Some people may be just ideologically so far into this that they can't see what damage they're doing. But I would start by assuming that they're not bad, and there's probably more going on that you maybe could be an ally in the process, and hopefully you can be.
That's really great advice. You know that we're all about being practical here at PD. So are there any other action items that parents can take away from what you've seen and are seeing in Beaverton? You did a pretty good job outlining a few things already, but are there any others?
Yeah, I guess if I could try to whittle it down to a few, because there were a lot of things in there, but definitely what I've learned, and I still do, I was just at a school meeting the other day and continue to go to board meetings or listening sessions to meet other parents, right? I think I felt long time ago, 18 months ago, that I was just going crazy and I was the only one dealing with this stuff, and going to board meetings, connecting with other parents on Facebook has made a world of difference to know that I'm not crazy. There are other people out there who are like me who don't really know what to do, but want to talk. And so I think that's been great, especially coming out of a pandemic. We've been in a bubble, just connecting with other humans and having these conversations has been great. People who I would have never talked to other than, randomly ran into them at a meeting. And so just search Facebook. I'm sure you can find different groups in your state and your area that organize parents, get them together. The other is get educated. Just do a web search. Go search for restorative practices in schools. I guarantee you're going to find a lot of resources. And of course, Parents Defending Ed website. There's a lot of stuff there as well. And then for the other fellow data geeks out there, go for the data and ask. I mean, public records request laws vary by state, but you should be able to go in and ask. You might start with asking the staff for it, but if they don't want to release it, go to a public records request and get their disciplinary data, find out when they implemented restorative justice, get the disparity, get the details, and so that you can see, hey, is it working? Is it not? Are they artificially limiting it? And then, hey, if you got questions, reach out to me. I have my Twitter handle there. Find me at saveoregonschools.org. I'm happy to share what I can, when I can, to help others learn and inspect what's going on in their district and try to help make a difference.
Well, thank you for that, Jeff. You definitely are a dad on a mission. And I love, how you introduced yourself earlier, where you said, you know what, I have a day job. Activism isn't something that I do 24/7. So thank you so much for letting our members and viewers know where they can find you, so they can look you up on Twitter. So be kind of in closing now, be aware of what policies and practices are implemented in your child's school and ask questions. Jeff, outlined that go and dig up the data so you can then tell the story to your school administrators, school board members, and fellow parents as well. If you find something concerning at your school, please reach out to us at defendinged.org and share this video with a friend and tag us. Jeff, thank you so much for joining us again.
Thank you, Scarlen. It was really great. Thank you.